Welcome into the Dino Construction Podcast. Today we talk RB roster construction, how we build our tiers, who are in our tiers, and trades involving RBs in real leagues. My name is Justin, joined by my co-host and rivals, my friend David and JP. You may notice if you're watching on YouTube, David is under construction, some camera issues, but nothing that is going to keep us from bringing you content. We will always figure it out. We also want to give a huge shout out to everybody. As we mentioned in last week's episode, we were on the cusp of 100 subscribers. By the time this video drops, we expect to be at 200, sitting at 197 now. So we are opening a listener league. If you are interested in joining our listener league, we have 6 spots that we are auctioning off. We're giving some to people who have helped us with production, etc., as well as, of course, playing with us three. 3 of our spots will be given to anybody who likes, subscribes, and comments on the mega thread below with your favorite dinosaur. Little fun dino joke there. David came up. I love it. So comment, like, and subscribe. Comment your favorite dinosaur. 3 more will be given away on X/Twitter. Link is in the episode description. Very similar type of deal there. So 6 spots that we're giving away. We want to play with you guys. We will also have the league bylaws in the description below. It'll be start 11, 1.75 tight end premium. We are looking at a $25 buy-in to make it competitive, but not pricing anybody out. So please go ahead and get yourself entered. We will randomly select 3 people from those 2. So with all that said, thank you so much for all your support. We are going to hop right into our community section segment where we read responses to a question you guys had last week. And what was that question, David?
Yeah, so first of all, sorry about the camera issues, guys. No idea what's happening, but we'll figure it out eventually. Um, so last week's question was, what is your ideal running back roster construction? Does it differ between competitive teams and rebuilding teams? What about various starting lineups like 2 flex or 3 flex? Feel free to mention any other rules or settings you find impactful to the ideal roster construction of your RB room. JP, go ahead and read our first response.
And the first response we have here is from that fantasy football chick. She says, for my RB construction, right now I'm zagging away from wide receivers that aren't studs. For example, say Flowers was a great rookie, but I couldn't sell him to get anything in the 108 to 112 range. Multiple leagues, that was in multiple leagues, even though if any of those wide receivers hit like Flowers did, you'd pat yourself on the back. Just my goal is to have one anchor between my big 3, Bijan, Brees, and Gibbs. Outside of that, I look for solid RB2s like James Cook and Buffalo is one of my main targets. I love Achane, and I'm not concerned about consistency there because he can win you a week. Outside of that, I want cheap backfields. Some of my buys are guys like Devin Singletary, Tyrone Tracy, Kamara, and Kendre Miller. The cheaper, the better. I'll sell a Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison with a 25 third to get a James Cook and a 25 second. If I'm rebuilding, I go pure RB0 strategy. I flip all of them for futures. 2025 looks promising, so some contending teams set with QB wide receiver cores may not want to flip their 2025s yet. I definitely agree on the zero RB rebuild strategy. Definitely want to sell some RB shares when you are trying to rebuild because you want to get those points off your roster. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit more later here about the strategy and why we sell those running backs in a rebuild. And Justin, what is the next response that we have here?
Our next response is from a friend of the show, Awesome Dumplin. Said, man, I don't know anything. I've learned so much. I've learned this last year that I don't like any running backs not named Christian McCaffrey. I think I like to have younger guys who have proven it. So he's talking about those same guys that yours was. Bijan, Brees, and Gibbs. I also really like undervalued bets. Derrick Henry, RB1, he says. Awesome Dumpling is a Titans fan who still loves Henry, even though he's gone. I do like older vets. We like the undervalued ones, which means don't pay top prices for them. And that's what he's saying to the undervalued vets, not the ones that people want the money for. But he definitely is on to something there that, in my opinion, running backs that are not named Christian McCaffrey, a lot of them give you pretty similar production, right? There's a lot of guys that give you very similar production. So undervalued cheap guys, I love that. So thanks as always for the response. And who is our last responder from the comments, David?
Yeah, our good friend of the show, Trav Bob. He says, for RBs, I only want Brees, Gibbs, or Bijan on a rebuilder. I would still sell them if I was a ways away from competing, though. If I am rebuilding, I want no other RBs of value. For competing, I would love one of the three above, but you can buy old boys and get close enough unless a rebuilder is selling the big three RBs for a fair price and not gouging. So honestly, that is basically a bullet point that I have below in my notes almost exactly. So I agree with what he's saying there, and I'll expand on it here in a minute.
And David, what are your main thoughts about this question? Because I feel like we're pretty similar, and I do a lot of talking. So why don't you explain our strategy?
Sure, yet again. I'd probably be a little bit shorter than I was in the QB and wide receiver episodes because I do think it's pretty straightforward how we want to approach running back. But I do think some scoring settings have a bigger impact than they do at other positions. Like a start nine, for example, it's a lot harder to carry a weak running back room just because you have less starters to pick up the slack. So shallow leagues, we also have settings like half point PPR, which kind of shortens the gap between the wide receiver position and the running backs, or any sort of point per carry. All those things do make running backs a little bit more valuable, and you have to consider those. But generally, RBs aren't part of my core. Even Bijan, Brees, and Gibbs, like if I have one and I'm rebuilding, sure, I'm not desperate to sell them, but I'm still open to tearing down from them, much more so than I would be from like a wide receiver or a quarterback who I consider part of my core. Whether I'm rebuilding or competing, I do want to fill my bench with handcuffs running backs just to hope that they get a spot start and spike in value. And the more of them I have, the better the chances that I can capitalize on the inevitability of a running back injury. Just kind of depends if I'm competing or rebuilding will dictate how I handle that spike in value.
Yeah, of course. And much like last week in our QB episode, where again, you want your roster spots to be backup QBs or now backup running backs, not wide receivers. This sounds like it's very inspired by Scott Connor from DT5 again. So want to give a shout out because I know that we both were heavily influenced by him. We love to steer people in the direction of other good content creators with great strategy. So I assume again that is very relevant here, David. Don't want to talk for you though.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it comes from other people too. It's definitely around the community, but Scott's definitely someone I listen to a lot and has helped guide me, and especially the back end spot on the roster. Like even before I started listening, I didn't want to overinvest at the top, but now I understand the value of the back end spots a little bit better. Basically, I want to make my running back room as bad as the settings allow me to. Always happy to take on good value if I'm competing. You know, maybe I feel like I need to go buy a stud mid-season. Bought CMC last year, and I was the champion in that league. I know there's good luck as well, but there are definitely times I'll go away from having a bad running back room. It's always context driven. So if I'm competing, I'd pretty much just care about the production this season. Age is a small factor, but I just want to compete this year. You need at least one stud. Sometimes you need two, depending on the settings. And then after that, I just want as cheap production as I can get. And then, like I said, if I need to plug a hole in season, I'll go trade for one. But if not, then I'm just going to ride the bench as I have it. So if I am competing and I have a running back on my bench who gets a spot start, I will keep them and start them if I feel they'll increase my chances to win. And if I don't, though, then I do want to sell them because I want to get some liquidity. I want to get a draft pick so that I can plug a different hole later. But if I'm rebuilding, I'm always going to sell. I'm never trying to start them. I'm trying to sell all my studs, like Trav Bob said, and then kind of like JP was talking about, shorting your production at RB is a good way to increase your draft positioning. I will say, though, I've seen a lot of people do it by not rostering RBs. I don't really agree with that. I think flipping backup RBs is just too valuable to ignore that. Just don't have any studs, though. If you don't have any studs, probably won't hurt you too much for your draft positioning, even in max points 4. So yeah, just don't have studs on your roster if you're trying to short your RB production, but still keep those backups and keep churning and burning those guys. That way you can have as many draft picks as possible.
Oh, I definitely agree. In my three rebuilds last year, I got a top 2 rookie pick. Either getting the 101 or 102, and that was because I sold on my running back production. Yeah, you're definitely going to want to sell that production because the running back position, it's not a position where you're going to see big spikes in value unless it's a rookie running back or, like David said, a backup running back. Those are the kind of guys I want to have filling out my RB room in a rebuild. Pretty much when you're rebuilding, you're just trying to identify assets that you think are going to increase in value so that hopefully down the road you just get enough value so that you can turn it around to compete. So yeah, the rookie running backs and backup running backs in a rebuild, that's what I'm going to stick to all the time. I mean, those top 20 redraft running backs, they're expected to score points. And yeah, you're going to want to trade away those guys because, like I said, they're not going to really increase much in value and they're just going to hurt your draft position. But in a contending build, I personally like to go with like a hero RB build. And that's because, like you guys said, I don't want to overinvest in the RB room. I don't want to have to, I don't want to hold 3. top 15 dynasty running backs. But if I get that one RB that can really, carry my RB room, like for instance, the reason I want to do that is because the difference between the RB2 last year compared to the RB10 is nearly 6 points per game. And it's still super, super valuable if you get one of those top 2 or 3 RB finishes on your team. It's really going to help your chances a lot in winning the league that year.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything both of you said. I have a kind of experiment I'm doing in my brain here, thinking about, do I actually want to hold high end handcuffs? So I'm talking about guys like last year Zach Charbonnet, this year Blake Corum. So last year Zach Charbonnet was probably ranked in a very similar point in most people's minds, individual rankings, as where we're going to see Blake Corum ranked right now. So Blake Corum is pretty much universally the highest premium handcuff out there. Like he's the guy that if Kyrie Williams goes down, everyone just assumes 1-for-1 replacement. And Charbonnet was viewed pretty similar like that last year. Now, right now, you can't really do very much with Charbonnet. I have him on some teams. He is not really able to move until an injury actually happens to Kenneth Walker. But right now, you can move Blake Corum. So I kind of have just like a personal preference here. You can disagree with me if you guys want, as well as in the comments below. But if I can get kind of the cash price on a Blake Corum, so he is priced at approximately the same on Keep Trade Cut as a early second in 2025. If I could flip him for a second that I project to miss the playoffs, certainly, and a third, I am very happy to do that. And I think you could, easily get a fringe playoff team second and third next year. I'm probably taking that. I have to admit, there's a chance he's worth a first if Kyron gets injured. There's also a chance somehow he just overtakes Kyron and I'm wrong. But I just love the idea of taking like a profit now on him, getting a roster spot, and going on what David was saying, taking another running back that's even cheaper that I think has a chance to still spike in value later and just continuing to churn. So I think I want to stick away from the high price handcuffs as much as possible. I am curious how you guys think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just depends on how you get them, right? If Charbonnet was the top of the board when I was on the clock and I couldn't trade the pick, I'll take him and I'll sit it out and be patient, try to trade him when I can. You said a second and a third for Quorum. I would do that in a heartbeat. Honestly, if I can get a second for any handcuff that doesn't have a reasonable shot at starting soon, like taking the job, I'll probably do it. I meant to mention this earlier too, but in those kind of trades, if I can get another handcuff running back coming back my way, that's the real money trade right there. If you get a guy who's spiking, who's starting, you trade him for a pick and another guy who might spike a few weeks later, you just keep the process going, keep the wheel turning. So yeah, if I can get a second or even a second plus for any of these guys, I would definitely do that.
Yeah, I just think holding those guys, if you can liquidate them, I like to not hold much value in my running back room. I like to have two starters, and if I have anyone outside of my two starters that I can get a second or more for, I like to try to sell them at price. So, for example, I don't dislike Aaron Jones, but I have him as a RB3 on about 3 rosters, and I've tried to move him for a second on all of those teams. I haven't been successful in doing so, but I sent out the offer to all 11 other managers in those leagues. And I kind of recommend not holding these players that Aaron Jones could easily be worth a second, but he's also in a new spot. Insert any name of any player. Tony Pollard, who's also in a new spot and could easily be worth a second, right? Anyone who you just have a lot of uncertainty in, unless you are relying on them as a potential starter. If they're your third running back, they're gone for a second for me, and I will try to buy somebody for that second later on. Caveat is know your league. There are leagues I have played in where Brian Robinson needs a first. Like every running back, the guys are like, I need a first for this guy, or I just won't sell. I'll hold him forever. If your league is absolutely crazy like that, then kind of adjust and maybe don't liquidate your running backs if you know you won't be able to buy them. But last year, for example, it was very easy to purchase Ezekiel Elliott for a third or even 2/4 near the playoff time. You could get guys who were good, usable, like Gus Bus as well, for the similar 2/4 or a third price. So you can always buy guys cheap. They might not be studs, but like David said, if it's not start 9, if it's a start 10 or start 11, like we often play in, we like to just have our assets allocated into stud wide receivers that can score us a lot of points, and then running backs that keep up with the other teams just enough. So just kind of a different strategy that we kind of prescribe to, and then fill in the running backs last type of situation. So I think we're kind of pretty aligned with some of our listener responses as well. If you missed out on the community question, you can also let us know your thoughts on this one below, as well as next week's community question. And what is next week's community question, David?
Yeah, we'll be finishing out this little series here on the position groups. We want to know what your ideal tight end roster construction is. Does it differ between competitive teams, rebuilding teams, about different levels of tight end premium, or start two tight end? And feel free to mention any other rules that impact your process with tight ends. And Justin, where can they respond?
So, of course, in the comments below, we'd love to see them. We'll have a thread you can comment on. You can create your own comment too. Of course, it's anarchy. Do whatever you want in the comments. You can also reach out to us on X at DinoConFF. Our individual Twitter handles also in the episode description below. We also answer trade advice if you send us DMs, etc. Or you can email us at dinoconstructionff@gmail.com. So, love to hear from you guys. So now that we've gotten our community question out of the way, we're going to move into our main tier question. And because we want to focus on tier strategy, not just our tiers, we're going to start off with just a strategy question about tiers. How can we use tiered rankings to your advantage in a startup draft?
Yeah, there's a few ways that I like to use my tiers. The most obvious is to help you determine when you should try to trade up or trade down. If you're on the clock and you're targeting a player at a position in a deep tier, there's still a lot of players left in that tier. You'd probably be able to trade back, get some extra value, and even if you don't end up with your player, you're still going to get a player in that tier most likely. Or if you missed out on the wide receivers you want, you're trying to get up and get one of these elite guys, and you notice there's only one or two left in the tier, then maybe you need to explore trading up. So you can just kind of watch how they deplete, and that helps you decide which way to move. At the beginning of a draft, sometimes I like to map out some goals or guidelines, like get at least one QB in the top two tiers. This helps me make sure I don't over or under draft positions, but you got to make sure you don't panic if you miss on a goal. Like you just have to go with the flow of the draft. It just kind of helps as a guideline. And then also for teams that are near the turn, not at the turn, obviously, because you pick back to back, but if you're near the turn, you can't decide between two players. If one of them is in a deeper tier, you take the other guy first, and then hope that with your second pick, that guy's still there. But if not, like I was saying above, hopefully you're still at least in the same tier.
Yeah, and that advice about that way of handling tiers on the turn, especially that David just talked about, doesn't have to be RB specific, right? You could have an RB in one tier, you could have a wide receiver in a different tier, and if one of those tiers is deeper, take the guy in the shallower tier. That's a beautiful piece of advice, David, for anyone in a startup draft. Very actionable, so really appreciate that. I'm sure our listeners do too. Now let's dive into our RB tiers. And going right back to you, David, even though you just finished talking, we want you to talk more because we can't see your face, just so we remember you're here. What are we looking for in this first tier of RBs?
Yeah, we're looking for young studs with as much value insulation as an RB can have, and RB1 overall upside, at least this year, but probably the next few years. Generally, these guys are interesting to both contenders and rebuilders.
Yeah, these are the only guys we all mentioned we have any interest in having in a rebuild, but even then, still willing to sell. JP, who are these few elite guys?
That is going to be Bijan Robinson, Brees Hall, and Jahmyr Gibbs. And like you said, these are the only running backs in the top three tiers that I want to hold in a rebuild outside of a rookie. And that's because I think that they are going to stay in this value range this time next year. And Dave, what do you agree with that? Do you think these three guys will have the same valuation next June?
If I can guarantee that they won't get injured, yeah, absolutely. But especially with Brees Hall, injury concerns me a little bit just because he's already had a major one. But these guys are all great running backs. They're all still young. So assuming good health, yeah, they should all still be tier one next year.
I agree with that assessment on tier one. Now, JP, what are we looking for in tier two?
Here we're looking at running backs that you would be excited to have as your RB1. One of them's a little bit older, a little better. The other one's a little younger, but these guys are no longer considered young. And Justin, who are the two RBs in this tier?
Yeah, so we have Christian McCaffrey, the literal cheat code. It's like Tyreek Hill, right? He's up there with the younger guys just because he can win you a league. And we have Jonathan Taylor, who, while not a cheat code, we literally have seen an RB1 season from him, and he is still young enough. Obviously, not young enough to be in tier one, but young enough that we kind of differentiate him slightly from tier three.
I think that these are both two guys you clearly are only going to want at roster in a contending build. And if you're rebuilding and you have these guys, definitely sell them as soon as possible because their value is very high right now. and there's a decent chance that it dips down to tier 3 next year.
Let me ask you guys this. If you're competing, do you put McCaffrey in tier 1 or move Jonathan Taylor out of tier 2, or do you just leave it as is?
I mean, if I'm competing, yeah, I have it slightly tiered differently. If I'm competing, I would not trade anybody in tier one for CMC, so I don't put him in the same tier as tier one. I could just never do it, but I would definitely consider if I'm competing having this tier almost split into a 2A, 2B, slightly different tiers where I would be willing to add a little bit to Jonathan Taylor, my own second if I expect it to be super late and I still have flexibility to bail myself out of problems in case CMC gets injured. I might be willing to consider that if it's a start 9 especially and I really need that hammer. In a start 11 or deeper, I think I just want to stay younger and not have the risk of CMC. So tough question though, David. Why are you stressing this out right
Well, you can't see my face, so I just want to make sure everyone remembers that I'm here.
now?
All right, Justin, moving on to the third tier here. What are you looking for in identifying these third tier running backs?
I mean, so this is kind of similar to if you watched our wide receiver tier episode. You noticed I said I kind of identified this one tier that one big identifying factor for me is I expect to be able to get a future first for everyone in this tier. And I think in this tier, I could, if I sent out to every team in my league for a 25, I'm willing to also take a 26 first because some teams don't have 25 first. And I sent out for all of these guys to all 11 other managers. I think I would get a first back for these guys. I don't feel comfortable with any tier past this point. But on top of that, these are also guys that I think have a chance to be top 5 producers this year. Some of them I think are less likely to be a top 5 producer, but I think it's in their range of outcomes. Other ones, I think if they stay healthy the whole year, it's a pretty probable outcome for them. They have different concerns. It could be new competition. It could be a new location. It could be coming off of an injury type of concerns. So they all have blemishes that keep them out of the elite tiers. But there's a reason that they are here and not lower. They are guys that you're excited to have them as your RB1 on a dynasty roster if you couldn't get anybody above here. And David, who do we have in that tier?
Yeah, so this is kind of our first big tier so far. Got Travis Etienne, Devon Achane, Kyron Williams, Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Brooks, and Kenneth Walker. And I would just say I think Brooks is probably the one that doesn't have top 5 overall in the season upside, but I think from the time he starts starting to the end of the season, he could definitely reach that. I'm just a little concerned with a rookie coming off an injury. Probably expect a little bit slower of a start.
Justin, which players here do you think could jump into tier 2 this time next year?
The only two guys that I think really could jump into tier two are probably Jonathan Brooks and Devon Achane. Achane has a healthy season. I can never say his name right. I also can't value him correctly, as I always say. But if this man has a healthy season where he smashes, he could put up crooked Christian McCaffrey numbers, be in that offense with a coach that knows how to use him. And I think it's not even impossible for him to jump into tier one if somehow he stays healthy for a full year, putting up the type of metrics that he was able to put up last year. And then Brooks, if he has a really strong end to the season, where from week 8 to 16 or so, he is, like David said, a top 5 or top 8 fantasy running back. I also think he could jump into tier two, but I don't necessarily see him having the ability to jump into tier one like a super freak Achan can do. David, do you agree with that more or less?
Just gonna say the Kyron Williams hate is real, huh? He's 23. He was RB2 in points per game last year. You don't think if he does that again, he's gonna move up a tier?
Oh, I think he could as well. That's a good point, David. I just didn't want to steal your guy that you're going to talk about in our buy sell video. I wanted to give you something to talk about.
Oh, well, I'll go in depth a little bit more on that one. So be ready for that.
And to your point just about Achan, yeah, I could see a lot of similarities between him and Jameer Gibbs. They're both very explosive. They have upside as a pass catcher, and they don't need to be workhorses to be, top 5 fantasy running backs. So yeah, I think that's a good point. I do also worry about his size and injuries, but he's a special player.
Yeah, and now we're moving away from these guys that, even though they have a little bit more blemishes than the top guys, we still are happy to have these as RB1s to guys that we maybe are more accepting them as our RB1 in this fourth tier, and how do we really define this tier?
Yeah, this one is pretty tough to define. These guys don't really have a ton in common, just other than they're not old. even though one of them's approaching old. I think they all have back end RB1 as a possibility in the range of outcomes. With running backs, I guess that means they probably have top half RB1 somewhere in their range of outcomes, just probably not going to hit it. Some of these guys have a little chance to move up, but I think most of them are probably at their like tier ceiling. Even if they have a good season next year, being another year older, they'll probably stay around this range. If one of them really breaks out, they could go up a little bit. Most likely, though, these are the guys that you're really happy to have as an RB2 and you might be able to get away with as an RB1, just a little uncomfortable with it.
And JP, who are these slightly uncomfortable running backs?
We have James Cook, Isaiah Pacheco, Rashad White, Josh Jacobs, and Trey Benson. And James Cook, Pacheco, and Rashad White, they're all third-year players. I feel like we've seen an upside from all three of those guys, but we know that they're limited in some one way or another. Justin, which one of these guys would you be investing into, if any, on a contending roster?
The cheapest. And I don't mean the guy that's cheapest on keep trade cut. I'm happy to inquire with every manager, but my big concern with all of these guys, and every time I've had trade talks, which I've had trade talks for all of these guys in multiple leagues, is people want a 25 first for any of them. And like I said about tier 3, that's the last tier that I feel is worth a 25 first. Not even that I'm comfortable paying a 25 first for tier 3. I just am comfortable I could get one for those players. This tier, there's no way I'm paying a 25 first for. If I can get any of these guys for 2 seconds, that's a risk I'm pretty willing to take. So if I can't get any for that, no thank you.
Can I just ask then why you wanted a first for Josh Jacobs when I reached out to you about him?
Because I'm petty in that league, and I'm just going to ride all of those old players off the cliff so nobody can compete with me, hopefully, and then just
I'm going to compete with you with or without Josh Jacobs.
In hindsight, I wish I would have asked for 2 seconds. What can you do? Sometimes you shouldn't hold out on trades just to try to stop people from getting on your level, because they will go shop from somewhere else and then you lose as well. Don't be afraid of trading with people you're competing with. Both teams can win trades, and you lose trades when you don't make trades a lot of the time just by not participating, especially if you have excess. Something I learned and have some regrets that I have from not wanting to trade with my rival here.
The rivalry is certainly real.
And JP, could you go ahead and define for us what we're looking for in our next tier, tier 5 of running backs?
So this tier, it is filled with a bunch of veteran running backs that we're looking at that are locked into a role that we're confident in. And we think that they're going to produce around RB2 levels of production, maybe a little higher, maybe a little bit lower. And Justin, who do we got here?
Yeah, so in this tier, we have Mixon, Derrick Henry, Montgomery, DeAndre Swift, Najee Harris, and Elvin Kamara, Super Kamario. There are a lot of older guys in this tier. David, how do you kind of assess this tier or these players? Is there anyone you're specifically targeting in this range?
I think you said it best in the last tier there, the cheapest one. If I'm competing, I think Najee maybe has the most upside, but I don't expect him to hit it. He's the youngest guy, and if he does take that role back, get an extension maybe we could see moving him up a tier, probably not two. If I'm looking into this tier, I assume I'm competing. So I'm probably starting with Henry and Kamara and going from there.
Yeah, what I like about David Montgomery and Najee Harris particularly is that they're expected to produce RB2 levels, but they also have contingent upside. If Jahmyr Gibbs goes down, David Montgomery's probably a top 12 running back on that Lions offense, and not 100% sure about that. Same thing with Najee Harris, but I do think that he's more valuable if Jaylen Warren does go down, especially with how much they're expected to run the rock down there. So yeah, I kind of like having guys on my team, if they're RB2s, to have that contingent upside to really, win me a 3-4 week stretch, if the backfield mate of theirs does go down with injury.
Yeah, and what I said earlier about I don't want to hold handcuffs, these guys are not handcuffs. David Montgomery has handcuff built into decent running back production. So good point there, JP, that they standalone value with the handcuff is very different than I was talking about in our earlier community question segment. I love that. Thanks for bringing that up.
All right, moving on to our sixth tier here, Justin. What are you looking for in these running backs in this tier?
Yeah, so here we seem to see lead backs on bad offenses, people with questionable track records, or RBs on murky rooms who could potentially step up. They could potentially take this room over. They have some competition, perhaps. So it's guys with upside, but guys that we don't want to have, if these guys are your RB1, you're probably peeing your pants going into the season. And if these guys are your RB2, you're content if you're us, but most people would usually look at this guy as your RB2 and say, I need to upgrade that. I need to upgrade that. So not a lot of count. And who are these guys, David?
Yeah, so we've got Zamir White, Ramondre Stevenson, Tyjae Spears, Javonte Williams, Jalen Warren, Brian Robinson, Blake Corum, and Zach Moss. There's some production in there. There's some ugly names for sure. Like maybe if you've had a few beers, you kind of squint at them. Probably everyone can find a name or two they like in there. We're not, thrilled to be putting these guys in our lineup right now. We're counting on them in any way.
What stands out to me with our tier here is between, which I made a post about this on our X account. Zamir White is RB19 and Zach Moss is RB36 on Keep Trade Cut. I think that gap is crazy. I mean, we have them in the same tier here. Justin, what would you take to tier off? Not tier off because we have them in the same tier, but to move down from Zamir White down to Zach Moss?
So I actually have Zamir White in tier 5. I'm the outlier here. So I'd still probably do it for a third. Maybe I'd ask for a third and like a backup spot start type of running back type of guy. Give me like a Tyrone Tracy, Isaiah Guerrero, some running back that I like as a rookie who can just sit on my roster and maybe spike in value later on. But I need a little bit because of the fact that I have them in different tiers. If you were to ask me that with any other name on this list, because Zamir White's the only one I have in tier 5, the answer would be a third. Happily, shake hands, run to the bank. They're all in the same tier. They're all question marks. I don't think I'm smart enough to know who that I have in that same tier is going to perform better than anyone else, so I'll take any profit. David, do you kind of agree with that general assessment within a tier? I think we've kind of been talking about that throughout our tier series here.
Yeah, I think in general, probably a third in this range would be enough to get me to budge from pretty much anyone to anyone. But if I'm competing, I consider it a little more. Probably wouldn't do that for Blake Corum if I need this guy to start.
Agree with that there. And while we don't have a 7th tier here, we're keeping a consistent 6 tiers like we did in our wide receiver episode. Quick honorable mention for players like Aaron Jones, Nick Chubb, Raheem Mostert, Tony Pollard, Austin Eckler that all fall into the next tier. Guys with a lot of upside. We also have a lot of backups who are young, but those guys are all old. They are having injury concerns, perhaps switching teams, other contributing factors. So there could be some valuable players you notice we didn't tier. Just want to say, can't include everyone in this video and also get into as much strategy. Those other guys below here, we certainly would not recommend spending a second on any of them and would absolutely liquidate any of them for a second in a heartbeat anywhere below the 6 tiers that we have. Now that we have done a deep dive into tiers, how we make our tiers, kind of how we price out our tiers a little bit even, we're going to go into startup strategy because it's startup season, baby. Let's go. And so I'm going to throw it right off the rip to JP because I think you're going to kind of start with a theme we all learned by doing and tell us a little bit about how you learned by doing your startup strategy.
Yeah, I wanted to start this off by talking about my first startup that I did. And in that startup, I went very RB heavy and it did not go well. I had guys like Christian McCaffrey, Tony Pollard, James Conner, Alvin Kamara. Those were my core players. And this was a year 1 contending build is what I was going for. Where I went wrong was I filled out my wide receiver room with a bunch of low end wide receiver 2s and 3s. And that proved very fragile because running backs, I mean, they get injured at a higher rate than any other position in fantasy football. So I had James Conner miss time, Tony Pollard, Alvin Kamara, all these guys missed time. And my wide receivers were so weak because, they were not guys that were hitting guys like Cortland Sutton, Allen Robinson, who busted. So you don't want to rely on guys that aren't, in the top 4 or 5 tiers of our wide receivers. If you haven't seen our video, you're going to want to build your team around wide receivers, as we talked about in our wide receiver startup strategy and tier video. Don't overinvest in running back like we've been mentioning throughout the video because I tried it and it certainly did not go well. And a lot of my running backs and my entire team, they just dipped down in value because, like I said, the wide receivers I had, they missed because I didn't get any studs, guys that are going to hold value. Yeah, I learned my lesson, and now I say screw them RBs. I think we all agree with that sentiment. But I also want to talk about the RB age cliff. So in a startup, I don't want to invest really in older running backs. And this is from ESPN. Among those who debuted since 2000, running backs experienced a 25.2% decline in PPR points per game and 37% decline from their age 28 to 29 season. Only 11 running backs have reached their age 28 and 29 season since 2010, and that group saw a 16.8% decline from age 26 to 27. But once you get running backs 26 and older, these are guys they're declining players at this point. I mean, the running back position is just so short-lived. So you don't really want to invest too much in 26 plus age-wise at running back. And also, this is from the Footballers website and their research. Most RB1 seasons are within that 23 to 26 age range. In fact, about 57.1% of all RB1 seasons since 2000 fall within that age range. So I just wanted to point this out just because I don't want you guys to lose value on running backs like I did with, Kamara, James Conner. These guys, they just lost so much value because they got less efficient as they got older and older. But David, give us a little bit more insight on your startup strategy here.
Yeah, sure. And JP, I have a very similar first startup story as you. I won't tell it because it's almost the exact same, but I think it was CEH and Dobbins that were the two that I invested in, and you all know how their careers have gone. The only time I've actually earned the 101 unintentionally. As I'm sure you can guess, as we've talked about several times so far on this podcast, this isn't the position I value highly in my startups, no matter what direction I'm taking my team. And I don't like to invest early for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think from my experience, at least, it's a lot easier to find quality RB production later in startup drafts. You can see guys that are going to have RB2 seasons in, the 12th, 13th round sometimes. And more importantly, they deal with injuries more often than any other position. And I was just curious. I know we've all heard this a lot, but I was just curious. I did a little research myself. It's not anything groundbreaking and should probably be expanded before I draw conclusions. But I was looking at the top 12 players at each position in August DLF ADP. Figure the top 12 going into the season should have starting roles pretty much guaranteed. RBs played in 79.5% of the possible games, where wide receivers played in 86.2% of the possible games. We also see 61.7% of RBs played in 14 or more games, and that jumps all the way to 71.7 for wide receivers. So they're just more reliable. You can count on them more to plug them into your lineup. And they do have longer shelf lives as well. So once I have a clear direction for my roster, I'll adjust accordingly. If I am trying to compete, I'm looking for those guys that have cheap production for me later in the draft. Maybe I'll try to make a trade through the offseason, but I'm not too worried about. I'm just trying to fill out production at that point. And if I'm rebuilding, I'm probably going to continue to wait and just look for value as it falls, and then I'll just start hammering backups once that time comes in the draft.
We're going to see that we all had a similar theory here, and we all had a similar issue with going RBs at one point or another in startups when we first started playing. First startup, I had issues with Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins that year as well, and it bit me in a couple of startups. I also took Delvin Cook in the third round of a startup right before he fell off the age cliff in one league. And while I made the playoffs, he was a dead asset the next year. And since then, I've gone so far in the polar direction. My general startup strategy is if I don't take a running back until double digits, I don't think that means I can't compete. Like, I think I can build out a running back room. In fact, I have teams where I expect to be playoff teams from this offseason where I didn't take a running back until literally the 10th round, the 9-10 turn, where I took Najee Harris. There are guys like that that are available. There's guys like Aaron Jones, James Conner, who's potentially a good startable. Raheem Mostert, I love him in like the 12th, 13th, 14th round, even potentially. Where can you get these nasty boys? So my strategy is try to get wide receiver hammers, try to get future firsts for my sixth round pick instead of trying to take a running back there so I can use that future first to buy a running back in season if I am competing with Mostert and whoever I can get laid on like that. And if I'm not competing, these nasty boys, I can sell them for like a second and compete year two. I know a lot of people say never punt year one, but like my general strategy with my running back room is be in a situation where I can squint and see them getting me through the first 4 to 5 weeks of the season competitively. Or I have wide receivers and running or quarterbacks that are hammers, hopefully a tight end who can give me some positional advantage. And then just the worst that I could do where I still feel like I have running back two potential and then make moves later. I don't ever go out of a startup thinking I have my lineup set. And if I don't think I have my lineup set, you can bet I certainly don't think I have my running back set out of a startup. And I think we all have that same general philosophy. Running back is our last position we want to feel comfortable with. Like David said, he likes to buy a stud mid-season potentially if he knows that he's competing and he can push in rather than trying to draft them in the startup draft because you never know if they're going to fall off a cliff between now and October of next year. But if they're playing well before your league's trade deadline, if you have one, which we don't like trade deadlines, but that'll be another episode someday. Buy them in season, and maybe you have to pay an extra second, but you're a lot better off paying an extra second or something to get that running back than drafting the guy who falls off the age cliff and you lose all of your value. So I think, like JP said, screw them RBs is the general philosophy here. Just acknowledging we do still need some of them to win, but we like to trade for them rather than drafting them and trade for them at value. Anything that we missed really in our strategies, if you think we've kind of given everyone the advice they need in how to beat us in our listener league that we will be starting that they can enter for drawing for, or are we now just like SOL guys? Are we gonna lose?
Oh, I'm gonna go RB heavy in that one. I'm just kidding. I think we pretty much covered it all. We kind of all said the same thing in a slightly different way. So
And now we are going to move on to our trade segment. So we are going to start off with a couple of trades in leagues involving all three of us before we go to just some that we pulled from dynasty-daddy.com. So right off the bat, all hosts trade alert, and not all hosts. I was not involved in this one, but it was David and JP made a trade in our Megala Dynasty League, the one where we all got together after we played in the Megala Bowl. Started a Dynasty League, start 10, Superflex full PPR. Go ahead and walk us through this trade a little bit, guys.
So I think JP is trying to compete this year. I think that's pretty obvious based on his assets and the way he's headed. He doesn't have the RB room built yet, so he's kind of patiently been sending out fielders all off season. And I've got some decent depth there. I feel like I had maybe a player or two too many on my bench that were flex level starters. Wanted to get a little more liquid, so we ended up coming to this agreement. And I really feel like this is a win-win. So I love when trades work out like that personally.
Yeah, as David said, I needed RB help, as I mentioned earlier. This is one of the leagues where I rebuilt and I got the 101, so I sold all my running backs, so I didn't have any really. So yeah, that's why I went and I got Jalen Warren. He's probably gonna be my RB2 or my RB3, and like I said earlier, I like a guy at my RB2 or 3 that has projectable volume and also has contingent upside. So yeah, I was pretty happy to acquire him as my RB2 here. And the next trade that I made, we're going to talk about my new RB1, which is Bijan Robinson.
Yeah, so in this trade, JP traded Neighbors 25 first late. Why do we know it's late? Because it's David's and he's the defending champion. And Demario Douglas, who is in a start 10, I consider that just to be someone I'm happy to throw on to get Bijan Robinson and a 26th second. I hate buying running backs. I understand paying this for Bijan. I think it's a fair price. I get the ick a little bit. I also get the ick a little bit because now you're trying to compete with us. And I mean, you could have waited a year, even though I told you you should try to compete with us. Why did I do that? I think it's a fair price. I think it's good for both teams. I think the guy getting rid of Bijan here gets a ascending asset, hopefully in the league neighbors. He gets a 25 first for insulation. Demario Douglas could be something. I don't really like him giving up the 26th second personally. Back, I would have tried to take Demario Douglas off if I was the other guy. So I really like that you got Douglas and a second added on there. I love that for you. If it wasn't for that part, I think I would like the other guy's side more, but I really like that part that you did there.
Yeah, looking at, I think I mentioned it to you, Justin. Freaking David, defending champions, got the easiest strength of schedule too, so I think he's gonna have a bye week, sadly. But yeah, that means it's probably gonna be the 109 or later. Probably not the 112. David, sorry, me and Justin are coming at you this year, but yeah, I wanted to have that one hammer RB. Like I said, I have Jalen Warren. I also have Ramondre Stevenson, and so I didn't really have a high-end running back. And I thought if I'm going to compete against Justin and David, I'm going to have a running back that really gives me a strong output here. So yeah, I already had way too much wide receiver depth, so I wasn't necessarily happy to move Neighbors, but in a way, it wasn't too bad because I had more than enough wide receiver help already.
And sometimes you have to move the wide receivers people want, not the ones you want to move. Also, can I just say, like, the commissioner gets the easiest strength of schedule. Collusion much.
Hey, I'm a co-commissioner. Thank you.
And moving on from trades in our leagues to trades in real leagues we pulled from dynasty-daddy.com. I'm going to throw to David first. In a start 11, KW3 and the 107 or Bijan.
This one is a tough one, I'll be honest, especially start 11. If Bijan's my hero RB, then I guess I'm probably staying Bijan. But if I've got a good roster that can carry, I mean, to start 11, I can probably live with Walker as my RB1. And then you add in that 107, and it's tough not to take the package there, in my opinion.
It's the kind of trade that will get done in real leagues. I mean, it's a big boy trade for sure. In a start 9, I'd probably smash Bijan. That's hard in a start 11, but I might. I think it's competing versus not competing, kind of like you're eluding. Like we always say, like I could see going either way. JP, it's not your question, but can I just get you to break the tie or to give me your opinion? Gun to your head, which side are you taking on a competing team in a start 11?
I just think Bijan is going to have that big season, so I'm going to stick with him even though start 11, yeah, that really is tough.
I should buy me some Bijan. He's just so expensive and I'm just so cheap. Now, our next trade, JP, pulling at your heartstrings here. ETN or Nico Collins?
I talked about Nico Collins in our wide receiver buy sells video, and he was a buy for me. I love Nico Collins. So, as we've talked about this whole episode, get the running back out of here. Give me Nico Collins.
Can't say I'm surprised to hear you say that one. I think it's a fair price if you're looking at the tier of wide receivers, but I also kind of think Collins is a buy right now. And David, Zach Moss or a 26 second. I think I know what you're going to say here.
Oh, yeah, give me that second, baby. I'll stay liquid. If I need to use that second to buy Zach Moss later in the season, even if his name isn't Zach Moss, I can find a similar player,
What if it's a 27 second? You still taking it? Someone's willing to pay their league dues that far out?
Maybe. I guess if I'm confident the league will be around then, but if I'm not, then I don't know. That's pretty far out. But probably, honestly.
Yeah, Moss could have a great season, but we like the profit, especially because we don't want to project the high end outcomes. We want to try to mitigate risk at the RB position whenever possible. JP, interesting constructed trade here. Rashad White and Christian Kirk, or James Cook and Hollywood Brown in the start 11.
That is very interesting. I have Rashad White and James Cook in the same tier. I see them pretty similarly. So it's going to be between Christian Kirk and Marquise Brown. And I just feel more confident in Christian Kirk. I know David's a little lower, so I'm curious to get his thoughts on this. But I think Christian Kirk's going to be better than Marquise Brown this season, even though Marquise Brown, he has upside there in Kansas City. But I'm going to stick with Rashad and Christian Kirk.
For the person that accepted this trade, not the person that offered it, but the person that accepted it, you should have asked the guy for a pick. This is like you're trading the same thing for the same thing. So if the guy approaches you and expresses interest, that means they want these guys. So try to get a little on top if you can. I'd probably go with Cook and Hollywood. I don't know. I don't care. This is the same thing. These kinds of trades don't make sense to me.
It's the same picture.
Spider-Man meme.
Absolutely. Insert meme about that. One way or the other. Could go The Office, could go Spider-Man, but it's the same thing. I don't necessarily disagree with that. It's player takes, and usually we're wrong about player takes as a dynasty, as a fantasy football community, right? We're wrong about player takes every year. Otherwise, ADP would just be all you needed. I definitely agree with David as well. Try to get a little something on top. Give me a third on either side, and that's probably the right way to go there. Thank you so much for sticking around for our whole episode. If you're here and you skipped our intro, in the comments below, we have a mega thread where if you like, subscribe, and comment on the main question we have of what is your favorite dinosaur, you can enter yourself in for a listener league spot. You can also do so on X. That information is available in the episode description. Get yourself entered for a listener league spot. You have 2 chances to do so, double your probability. We're giving away 3 on X, 3 here in the YouTube comments. So make sure to do that. We'd love to play with you, celebrating reaching 100 and by now 200 subscribers on YouTube. We are so happy to have you all along for our ride. So thank you for joining us for another episode of the Dino Construction Podcast from all of us here. We hope this was as useful for you as it was for us. And until next time.